the level of nuance that you're bringing to this and your own experiences, because that really shows up. I do want to encourage you to think in terms of accountability. Dr. Nate, you brought this up really well, that we can put the perfect program in place, but if we don't have some suggestion or practice around accountability, we may lose that, right? So module 1, the first 4 classes were around awareness. Now module 2, which is what we're in right now, from lesson 4 to 8 is around accountability, and then module 3, which is the last 4 classes, is around action. So think in terms of accountability, but things are going great, and I'm really happy with your answers, so thank you for that. I've been getting a little, I want to address feedback around the breakout rooms. I think this is really beneficial to some of us, but for some of us, we may want more time to go over some of the content that I've shared. So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms as usual, but I'm going to leave the option open for people who want to perhaps come back to the main room to talk to me, to go over any slides that they might have needed more details around. I do encourage you to participate in the breakout rooms because I think that's an opportunity for you to learn from your peers. But if you find that it's more beneficial for you to learn more from me, please, I am there in that main room, and you can click out and say return back, and we'll spend a little bit more time together. So ERGs, employee resource groups, I wanted to start off with a definition. There's a wonderful organization by the name of Catalyst, and ERGs are defined as voluntary employee-led groups that foster a diverse, inclusive workplace aligned with organizational mission, values, goals, business practices, and objectives. And before we go into the next slide, I wanted to kick off with a story. So I, as you know, used to work at Amazon, and this is a company that had 14 affinity groups and growing. So you may be thinking, what is an affinity group? In some cases, it's another word for an employee resource group, but I'll go into that a little bit deeper. There's a language, there's a reason why some organizations choose the language that they do when they refer to these groups. In any case, there were 14 affinity groups and growing. They served 1.3 million employees in 13 countries, and they had global chapters. And I was part of the global DEI team that laddered up to what we call the S team. But I was also sitting on an employee resource group. So I want to leave plenty of time at the end for those questions, because I have that lived experience of having sat in both the DEI space and the ERG space. And some of the things that I realized was, number one, not every ERG has a leader. So for example, the Indigenous group did not believe in having one person lead that group. So it was a shared responsibility. And that was something I didn't realize, because a lot of articles I'd read said, you want a leader at the head of your ERG. That's not necessarily true. The other thing I learned is that ERGs are always growing and changing. So there was an employee resource group that was focused on mothers, and that became parents, and that became caregivers. So you begin to see the transition and the growth in inclusivity, which I hope you see us practicing in this group and class as well. Finally, there were inequities among ERGs in terms of funding. So some ERGs got more funding, and some ERGs got less funding. And so that's something that we want to approach this conversation with as well. And then the last point I wanted to make is that we very often talk about change as being top down, and I wanted to demystify that. Because of my experience, I can definitely tell you that I have seen incredible mobilization to equitable policies by different employee resource groups coming together. When I was on the Asian affinity group, we were looking for leadership to make a statement on anti-Asian hate, and there was hesitation, but having the 13 other affinity groups sign on to our ask led to not only a statement, it led to increased funding to different groups. and a number of other policy changes that was beneficial to everybody. So I'm giving you a lot of hope that if you feel within your organization that you're limited to change coming from top down, ERGs are a very effective way of flipping that dynamic to say if we organize, we can definitely create top down changes. So with that, let's move on to our content. As I said, we are on our 7th class, and so DEI values, we had talked about this. There had been some thoughts on the first one. I changed it to create and engage in safe spaces. I took out the word brave, but there is a question in the Google Classroom inviting you to add in your thoughts around this if you think we should change it further. This is DEI in action. We are not necessarily going to get it right the first time. We want to continue to exercise this muscle of self-awareness and saying, let's continue to challenge each other and make sure that we change our language so that it's more inclusive. So our house rules, you're familiar with this by now. And then our house questions, which the middle piece is where I update with your thoughts on or your breakout room content from last time. So 5 things came up in our stakeholder conversation as best practices. Number 1, we have challenge stereotypes and what a stakeholder looks and acts like. So in the context of the stadium, we were saying, not all fans fill a particular prototype. They are different. There's parents there. There's a number of other different fans of different backgrounds. So let's, expand our ideas there and squash those stereotypes. Number 2, make it about more than capitalism and focus on barriers and access. Critical piece here. We have to understand how DEI works in the context of capitalism. If we're going to talk about this, we have to talk about the framework or the ways in which we're operating. We can't just talk about DEI as a standalone. It operates in the context of wider society. Number 3, make sure stakeholders are properly compensated and recognized. Another important piece. We don't just want to invite stakeholders. We want to understand what they have, what we can offer them for their involvement. And that's a really important piece in our ERG conversation today. So hold on to that. Number 4, create a community engagement process and identify SMEs, which stands for subject matter experts. 2 points here. Number 1, I love how the suggestion was a process, right? If I had just written create community engagement, that's very different than saying create a community engagement process. If you, start thinking through this lens, then we're thinking in terms of policies and practices. We're not just thinking about suggestions. We're thinking about what we can do to hold people accountable so they can't tap out when they feel like it doesn't necessarily apply to them. A process usually has some sort of a matrix or a system through which we grade things, but it's like marking off the different steps that need to be accomplished to say that something has been done in full. So start thinking through that lens. And also, when we talk about SMEs, I highly encourage you to use this term when you maybe update your own LinkedIn or profiles, or, referring to yourself as a subject matter expert is in high value right now in the DEI space. So some of us kind of struggle with that language. What do we refer to ourselves as? Use SME. It's very powerful, and people are willing to pay the dollars for subject matter experts. Finally, suggestion number 5 is start with asking what and why and focus on sustainable, inclusive design. Another excellent suggestion. Don't just, go forward and fill in stakeholders. Go back. Some of us call it a 30,000-foot view. So find out why we're asking the question. Is this even beneficial? What are we trying to do here? And if the answers come and we're content with them, then don't just put in some really quick practices. Focus on sustainable, inclusive design. And there's plenty of experts out there. I'm happy to create some, offer some suggestions. Perhaps people in the group have some suggestions of DEI experts they know that focus on inclusive design. One of the ones that come to me, and I'll write down her name here, is Annie Jean-Baptiste. She works at Google. She is responsible for inclusive design. And I know a few others. I'm sorry, I'm not going to write her name until I get the correct spelling, but I will update you with it. And she's a wonderful woman that creates inclusive design through the lens of being a Latina woman as well. So that is some suggestions as to how we can create a process. Okay, so this is our agenda today. We are going to focus on a couple things. Number one, about what are ERGs. We're going to look at the history, and we're going to compare ERGs with DEI and how they're different, because they definitely are. And then we're going to talk about growing and investing in ERGs, and then workshop number 7. I don't know if you all got a chance to look at the Google Classroom, but I did add in details of the case study in advance, because hopefully it will give you more time to think about it before we get into our breakout rooms, but I'm going to run over it quickly. LinkedIn is one of several recent companies who have decided to provide compensation, specifically $10,000 annually, to their employee resource group global co-chairs. And what my ask is in the breakout rooms is think about the challenges and opportunities with paying ERG global co-chairs. And my question is, would you follow the same model? And if you would, why or why not? And then name one best practice that you would apply to support ERGs being the best version of themselves. So let me go through the content with you. Quickly, I would love for you to drop in, some of us are fasting right now. It may be iftar when you break fast. What is the best meal that you had this week? So if you want to drop that in as an icebreaker, I'd love to hear your answers. And I will drop in mine as well. Well, thank you so much for sharing. There's definitely a love among everyone for food, so this is great to see everybody's answers. Okay, well, as we're going through that, here's our slide for creating and supporting ERGs. I'm going to drop in a quick poll. The question that I have for you is specifically around if you've been in ERG. So again, a reminder, ERG stands for Employee Resource Groups. Would love for you to fill in the answer here. Okay. So a lot of you are no, and we have a couple yeses. And this is interesting because we can learn from those that are part of ERGs. And if you haven't been part of an ERG, you may be wondering what the experience is like from the inside. And so that's why I want to leave time at the end for you to ask those questions. So let me stop sharing this, and sorry, 1 second. I may have used my chat. Adam, just give me 1 second. I think I accidentally closed the wrong window. Sorry, I'm just calling in my tech help. Give me 1 second. I apologize. Just give me 1 second.
Sorry, I'm just helping out here.
I meant to close my poll and I accidentally closed my shared window. All right, sorry about that, everybody. I meant to close my poll and I accidentally closed my chat, my screen. So hopefully you can see this. And okay, so we were here. Great. Okay, so what I wanted to tell you is that employee resource groups can start from casual grassroots, or they can start from a formal compliance model. And if you're either developing an employee resource group or you're a part of one, that's an important thing to remember, because if it's coming from the grassroots, it's a different power dynamic than if somebody's imposing this on you. And also, it works differently for smaller organizations. If you're somebody who works for yourself, you may be thinking, am I ever going to get to the stage where we even have that many employees, where we have employee resource groups? I think this is still a very important lesson for you all, because we can always learn from the community engagement that ERGs practice. So here is a visual of what ERGs look like. These are just some examples, a few categories, but you see here, we have sexual orientation, race, religion, national origin, physical ability, politics, and there's many, many more. Some of the things that ERGs do is that they create connection, they provide resources, they offer support, they create community, and they also collectively advocate for improvements in the workplace with decision makers. Employee resource groups also improve organizational culture, and something to note is that a lot of organizations use ERGs to market that organization is an attractive place to work. So if that's the case, they should probably be compensating ERGs for the work they do, seeing as they benefit from what ERGs do. McKinsey, which is a data company, one of the big consulting companies, surveyed about 520 organizations and 12 million employees, and they said that in 2020 there was a 38 to 40% spike in organizations supporting ERGs. So if you look at our first class, that aligns with that ginormous burst in interest in DEI, right? We definitely saw some increased conversations in racial reckoning, and with that, a lot of organizations said, we want DEI work, so you can see how that can lead to supporting ERGs as well. The problem is that some people have said that it feels like a second unpaid job, right? And so what do we do about this? One really quick best practice that I wanted to share with you is to change the language around volunteer work to cultural work, right? So very often we talk about ERGs as volunteer work. Let's start using the term cultural work and start adapting a mind shift as to what the value of ERGs really are. Okay. So the history of ERGs, a couple things to note. In 1970, Joseph Wilson founded the National Black Employee Caucus at Xerox, so we definitely want to give credit there. This was in response to the race riots that took place in Rochester, New York. ERGs have evolved from race-based to different identity groups. Hewlett-Packard in 1978 launched the first gay and lesbian employee network, and now we see many other organizations building communities around disability, age, interfaith, etc. So this is a quote that actually I came up with. ERGs are there to support communities with common identities. DEI practitioners are there to create strategies and execute programs and policies. Both build inclusive workplaces, but in different ways. Don't ask one to do the free work of the other, right? So in this quote, what I tried to do is create a distinction between ERGs and DEI, and I'm going to show you in the next slide what the differences are. But this is a good quote to kick it off by saying that, one is not necessarily a replacement for the other. They both bring different values, but as equally important values to creating inclusive workplaces. It's just not that one should depend on the free labor of the other. Okay, so here are the differences. ERGs, you can see on the left-hand side, focus on community, and then you have DEI on the other side, which focuses on strategy, right? ERGs often have leaders and local chapters depending on how big they are, and DEI hires a CDO, or that should likely be a consideration. CDO stands for Chief Diversity Officer or Diversity Council. ERGs are very often employee-led, whereas DEI is very often organization-led. ERG mobilizes employees and DEI has active governance. And then the last point is ERGs energizes around issues of interest, whereas DEI offers organizational insights. So hopefully there you can begin to see the differences. And as somebody who's been a part of both, I can definitely tell you that there's a messiness that comes when an organization assumes that ERGs is expected to do the work of DEI practitioners, or DEI practitioners are expected to do the work of ERGs. It is probably one of the biggest recipes for burnout, because the expectation is far beyond what one person or one community can do or should do. But we still have a section down here which says that both can be volunteer or paid, both foster an inclusive workplace, and both should be considered key stakeholders. So hopefully this slide helps as you start thinking about, do you want to be on the ERG side, the DEI side, or both, and how to make sure you have clear lines between the two and identifying the overlap so that we don't cause burnout, and with that, a rapid spiraling of losing people in the workplace. All right, so growing ERGs, there's 5 steps to doing this. The first one is gauging employee interest. Some people do this by sending out a survey. So if you have like-minded individuals, perhaps somebody of the same race or somebody who is a parent, you probably want to start by sending out a survey and seeing how many people would be interested in carrying an initiative like this. The second step is getting the executive sponsorship, budget, or support. And then the third step is defining the group's mission. So if you remember back to our earlier slide, if you can create a mission or a statement or a clause and you add it to all your content, then it holds everybody accountable to being aligned on the same work. This is also an excellent place to add in a suggestion for mentorship and sponsorship. So for example, your group's mission could be, the DEI, I don't know, the South Asian Employee Resource Group would like to advance mentorship and sponsorship for people who face the bamboo ceiling. So this is an example, putting in writing what your mission is and then making sure you have accountability measures in place. Then you have recruiting members. This part is really interesting because you can go a number of different ways. For example, you can speak at organizational all hands. You can publish your thoughts of bringing in other people through newsletters. You can have an ERG fair. So I went to one of these where each group sets up, what it's like to become a member, what people get out of it. And it was incredible to see how many people signed up for this. And then finally, invite allies. And the reason I say this is because the Human Rights Council has specific language around making sure that these groups are based on identity interests, but you cannot exclude people based on identity. So if you have an ERG, it's critical that it's open to anybody who wants to participate as an ally as well. I'm sure some of you have questions around this, like how does this work for safe spaces? But it is something that I wanted to share with you that is necessary as we think about how this work is done. Okay, so this is Allison Rutledge. It is real work. So she's talking about ERGs that benefit the business and benefits the environment, so should be compensated. JustWorks is one of the organizations who has compensated recently, put in a compensation model for ERGs, and this is one of the quotes from her. Okay, so next we have inviting in ERGs. I am a big advocate for executive sponsors. The reason is because I've seen this myself. When you have executive sponsors, you can see a massive change in the number of resources you get, and with the number of resources, you can get more ambitious with the projects that you embark on. So, executive sponsors, for one, have institutional knowledge and an inside perspective, and they can also make sure that ERGs are being amplified across the company. A couple other things is that they can influence processes. There's a wonderful woman who used to work at Pinterest. Her name is Candice Morgan. I'll put her name in this thing here. She is now at Google Ventures, but she's spoken a lot about ERGs and how she's run them over at Pinterest and what a great job she's done over there. So I would definitely look into that. And yeah, they can really be true advocates. But these are some suggestions that I put in, credit to Culture Amp, about how to actually engage executive sponsors. We don't just want them to show up, we want them to do specific things. So I've actually tried to detail them to the best of my ability to say, you know, these are some examples of how we can involve them and use their influence to make sure we can get what we want done. The last bullet there, you'll see provide resources. The three examples I've given actually link to our Thursdays class, where resources are not just money, okay? Resources in my expertise is time, budget, or money, and influence. So think of it like that, because we're definitely going to talk more about that in our next class. All right, so this slide is an important one because I think I talked about this earlier, but at Amazon, we call our employee resource groups affinity groups, and I found out there was a reason for that. But let me walk you through this slide quickly. Different ERGs are in different models, different sections of maturity. And you see along the side, the left-hand side, it says corporate funding and support. So an affinity group is usually one that's focused on awareness, networking, and support. As it matures with that funding and that support, you see an added box there around community outreach, recruiting, and mentoring. And then you shift over. So that's what we call an employee resource group. And then as you shift over further, you see the business resource group, or BRG, and you get an extra box there that's more about being involved as a stakeholder. So they're the ones that are building the inclusive products and services or being brought into conversations. This is not always the case. In some organizations, we use the language interchangeably, but be very cautious of what word your organization uses, because there's likely a legal reason behind that. I found out working at the organization I was that the reason they called the groups that were there, the community groups, their affinity groups, is so that they did not have a stake in some of the decisions that were made. So if you're part of an organization, a couple things you could do is challenge the organization to support ERGs or BRGs, shift away from affinity groups, or show them this maturity model and say, look, we want to get to the third area, the business resource group, whatever word we call it. The point is, like, we need some parameters around this. So the involvement of ERGs is not limited to just branding and marketing. We want the experiences and expertise of communities to be involved in what the organization is actually doing. So Nina, I see a hand raised. If you don't mind, I'm just quickly going to go through a couple more slides, and then I'll come to you first. Okay. So again, these are some real life suggestions as to how to look ahead and the future of ERGs. So I've tried to get as specific as possible here. Allocated work hours on group activities. Some people advocate for 10 to 15%. I advocate for maybe about 5 to 10%. That's all dependent on you. Recognition built into performance review periods. ERG leader training and development. Compensation built into bonuses or salaries. And then last is considered a key stakeholder involved in organizational decisions. And the sliding thing that you see at the bottom of the arrow is take out manager subjectivity, because if the manager is the one that's saying that an ERG or your work within an employee resource group is not important, you can see how that impacts so many things, right? So that's key to all 5 points that I've listed here. Okay. So one point that I did not include is that that all ERGs need to focus on synergies, right? This is the true future of ERGs. The best ERGs welcome employees from all backgrounds. They cultivate cross-cultural relationships within and outside the organization. And the most effective ERG programs encourage cross-collaboration between and among affinity groups to take advantage of synergies. I definitely saw this at Amazon, that the ERGs that came together are the ones that were really able to make policy changes within the organization. So, for example, it wasn't just BEN, for example, that's the Black Employee Network, that was standing for donations or recruiting from HBCUs. It was other organizations, other ERGs that also said we support this. So in turn, that made the leadership say, oh, okay, this impacts 14 different communities and not one, and so we're going to create a policy around this. Okay, so that takes us to our exercise. Nina, I wanted to give you a chance. Did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I guess I've been having a reaction to the idea of an executive sponsor, and it just makes me think about, I guess, if we were in the room and part of these decisions, would we need a sponsor? Also, sometimes sponsor, I don't know if it means that they're not doing the work too. So I'm just wondering, how does that framing come about? Like, is it not just an executive participant, or, somebody from the executive suite, or I guess I'm having a hard time with that.
Well, let me first begin by saying that an executive sponsor can be from the community themselves. That's actually really powerful when you have somebody that is in that role but also represents the community. So they have that dual positionality.
Does that mean that they have like a leadership title, like they're in the C-suite?
Yes. So let's take out the word executive, or we can replace it with leadership sponsor. But coming back to our class 2 classes ago, sponsor is just somebody who creates access for us, who may have access to positions that we don't have access to. And so when we pair with somebody who has access to those rooms or tables of influence, they are likely able to get the community or the ERG the resources that they need to do the work. To answer your question, yes, ideally we don't have that because we are considered key stakeholders and we're already at those tables of influence. However, the way stakeholder mapping goes, we are not at a stage of maturity where, and I don't even know if that's the right way to frame it, but I would say that ERGs is seen as a lump group right now. They're not seen as the group benefits that they bring to the organization. They're just seen as, there's HR, there's legal, there's PR, and there's ERGs. So until we get to a stage where we have that representation, we really need to engage with executive sponsors because they're the ones that have the access. And then that allows us to shift, how we do the work that we're doing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so we're at our exercise, and again, our case study is around LinkedIn. Some of you may be familiar with LinkedIn being one of the most recent companies to provide $10,000 annually to their ERG global co-chairs. But let me give you a little bit more details before we break into our breakout room. First of all, when LinkedIn announced this policy, they were not the first. Some of the others are JustWorks, Twitter, Uber, and I'm sure I'm missing several others, but I'm just pointing to some of the ones that also have other different compensation models, but they are finding a way to recognize ERGs for the work that they do. And what LinkedIn does is they give $10,000 only to the global co-chairs at the end of 2 years that they serve. They have 10 ERGs in total with 20 global co-chairs, and other leaders are recognized and rewarded in non-financial terms. So I don't know what that means. I tried to dig. I think it's only an internally shared process, but I wanted to share that detail with you before you get into your breakout rooms. And all of the employee groups have executive sponsors who provide quarterly feedback to managers on their, as part of their performance reviews. So some additional details that's worth sharing. And I've linked it here so that when you have the deck, you can read more about what exactly LinkedIn has done. So in your breakout rooms, what I ask is a couple things. So remember, if you find that the breakout rooms are maybe not the best use of time for you and you want to come back, I'm here, we can chat. But if you do decide to engage, here's the question: would you follow the same model as what LinkedIn is doing? Why or why not? And name one best practice that you would apply to support ERGs being the best version of themselves. So again, coming back to the purpose, we talked about this in our office hours. The purpose for you doing this exercise is to try to think in real life terms. Like if you were running an organization or you're part of an organization, you want to support your employee resource groups, what do you think is the best way? I have real confidence that you've started to develop this DEI lens. So I want to hear from you. I think LinkedIn is good in theory. I think in practice it has some challenges, but I want to hear from you what a best practice would look like in your opinion. So we will come back and discuss in about 15 minutes, and I would love to hear from all groups. So I'm going to put you in your breakout rooms now, and again, the option is there for you to come back and stay in the room if that's something that you prefer instead. Hi, Omarafe and Hannah. How are you?
Good, are you?
Good, good.
Good. We had just like a kind of a quick discussion about the workshop topic, and then just kind of fell back into kind of what our workplaces are doing in terms of employee resource groups. I'm from a company that is very new to DEI, and again the idea of, honestly, like I'm going to end up being the champion for it, it seems, which is, again, a combination of exhausting and a lot. But I think that employee resource groups could be very important for what we're doing. And I love the idea of that groups could support each other to kind of help move the conversation forward. I would love your thoughts on what can you do, like what would you do for groups? So our executive leadership team thinks they are very diverse and inclusive. They're also all white men from Utah.
Right.
So how do you challenge that idea without it being without people becoming defensive over it?
Yeah, I think that the wheel of power and privilege is really useful because what it does is it says that we all, can learn from it. It doesn't point the finger at anybody, and I want to be very clear when I give this advice. I absolutely think that leaders do need some finger pointing. However, if they're the ones that have access to the resources, we have to approach them strategically, right? And so from my experience, every time I've used that wheel, leaders have been like, oh, I can see where people are coming from. It doesn't corner whiteness or men, it corners privilege.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference in the language that we can use. And I have had great success in saying privilege is a spectrum, it's not a switch, and we all hold some degree of it. Every time I say that, I see head nodding among white men leaders because they themselves want somebody who doesn't make them feel like they're not important in the work. It's sort of a balancing act. But the more of these frameworks we can use, the more it brings people in, because they don't see it as just an opinion sport. They see it as something grounded in either academia or something that somebody's created at some point. So hopefully that helps.
No, I love that. Like I said, the whole reason I'm taking this course is to learn better language around how to bring this to the table. And I've definitely been using the term privilege. That also seems to be a bit of a hot button topic.
Yeah.
But it's just, where do you start? And that, we look at our corporate values in terms of like, we can always be improving. So I take it back to our corporate values a lot, but also the corporate values were written in a way that honestly reflect a lot of the white supremacy things that you talked about in our first course. You're just like, oh man, like we have a long way to go. But
Hannah, one thing I wanted to add is, if you think that you're going to be leading this work, definitely ask for double the resources that you think you'll need. Because it can't go wrong, right? You ask for double, you get half. But if you ask for what you need, you're going to get half of that. And remember, resources are time, influence, and the last one was time, influence. I have to look at the last one that I wrote. But we'll talk about that in our next class. So it's not just budget, it's the support that we need. Ask for double.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point as well, because I think we have a long way to go. And I would also say, like, I'm not in the HR group. I just happen to be the only female in the leadership team that is trying to take it somewhere. So it's starting literally in this course and then trying to bring that back and be like, we need more of this, and even just learning within the organization.
Yes. So Mel, you were asking, and I saw you put your hand up. You needed help in your class. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to come to it. But the wheel we were talking about was the wheel of power and privilege that was shared in our first class. It's in the deck, and how to start these conversations with leaders about, how their perception of diversity may be different than ours, and how to bring them into the conversation that they need to reassess what diversity and inclusion really means. And so that wheel gives a more holistic lens of where people may be. And you can actually map it. You can say, okay, I'm white, I'm man, I'm cisgender, I'm born in the US, all these things. And then you can start to unarguably identify your own privilege. So welcome back, everybody. I think all the rooms closed. And we have a couple minutes. I want to hear the best practices from all of you, and then I want to open this up to Q&A, because you may have questions about what it's like to straddle both those roles of ERG and DEI. So group one or room one, do you have a best practice that you'd like to share?
Group one was us. I'm referring to Devin, Dr. Nate, and Shantae. I don't think we had decided on a speaker. I can share some of the best practices we talked about, which was to start grassroots and pull the funding for the ERG group from the DEI budget, and not just pay the leader, but also to pay all of the participants as well. And one of the best practices Shantae shared with us in her experience was creating bylaws to ensure that your members are attending, the leaders are collecting attendance, people are attending events, and as people may want to trickle out of the group or trickle in, you're not paying annually, but you're paying on a monthly basis, so that you're capturing transitions of, disinterest or interest. I hope that got all of our points, group one. If I didn't, please chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly chime in because I want to get through the other groups, but this is great. A couple of things stand out to me. Pull funding from DEI, that this is great in theory, but what if the DEI group itself doesn't have a lot of budget? And so I think we can maybe align with the DEI group and ask for additional budget and say this is a DEI initiative, But I think if we depend solely on DEI, we may not get the resources, seeing as it's a very often strapped area within the organization itself. And I want to challenge you to say, what if there's like hundreds of participants? Is that something that we would continue to pay? And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer there. I'm just saying, I especially like what you said about attendance. One of the challenges with that is the people who often form ERGs are the ones that have the least time. Because the reason they're developing the ERGs or affinity groups or BRGs is because they need the support and the resources. So it's sort of this like seesaw effect, where how do we gauge what people's involvement is without putting a marker next to the things that they have the least of? So thank you for sharing, Tony. Lots to think about there. Room 2.
Hi, we were room 2. I was in a group with Sarai, Jeffrey, and Luce. I just want to quickly share some of the additional things we thought about to compensate ERG leaders is additional PTO for those companies who don't offer unlimited stock options. I think that's always a great idea. Title change, because people often get into these roles so that they can have that additional leadership experience so that they can level up in their career. So giving them that title change, like within whatever system you use, like a Workday, something like that, give them the ability to put it on their resume or their LinkedIn, and then also incorporate their ERG leadership role into their roadmap for promotion. Additionally, we want to compensate not only ERG leaders, but also those subcommittee leaders, because that's often a lot of work too. It doesn't have to be at the same rate, perhaps something lower, but still compensating them. And then lastly, a best practice is to have representation amongst the leaders. We often see, for example, women's ERGs at large companies are primarily white women, and those are primarily the leaders. So we want to make sure that there's representation from people from multiple identities, just to ensure that it is inclusive of everyone, and it gives people, the incentive to join, because they know that it truly is an inclusive group. And that's all.
Great job, Desiree, and I appreciate you thinking through that intersectional lens, where when we want women, are we just saying women that are white or women that are black and brown, women across the spectrum, in terms of even how we identify, like, are we including trans women there? Like, we want to be as intersectional as possible, especially in the representation of leadership. Love the idea of title change. Yes. This is a great time to say, ERG leader, ERG participant on your LinkedIn or on your profile, and then of course building it into your roadmap. And then remember that slide we had about manager subjectivity. So these are great suggestions, but how do we make sure that one manager will be like, yes, great, I love it. Another one will say, what's this on your roadmap? We need to nix this. So the more we find a sort of like a framework, or we create something that takes that decision factor out of the hands of managers to say this is important work or it's not important work, the safer it is for people to engage in ERGs and do the best work possible. So thank you. Room 3?
I was in room 3 along with Naima, Saleha, and Patrice, and similar to what Desiree said, we thought that would be a good idea to compensate the people who participate in ERGs, but we also thought that compensation can come in various forms, not just money. You could get like a half a day off for attending meetings, like every month you acquire some vacation time, so there are other ways to compensate people for their time. We also thought about that $10,000, which is a lot. So we're thinking about just a larger budget for LinkedIn, like how much are they allocating to ERGs in general, and sort of just like as a strategy, maybe engaging with people at the top or the leaders, just to say that this is a budget that you're committing to for the next 10 years. Like if you're allocating 5% of your budget, it should be the same and shouldn't change. Like, if the pandemic happens, then you're cutting ERG budget. So we want them to commit to having that kind of commitment to this group. We also said that it would be good for each ERG to have a strategy on, as they start their groups, and sort of talk about what their plan is for the rest of the year. and to figure out how they want to use their funds. So maybe not just an ad hoc use of funds. Let's say you're buying cookies, you're planning for meetings, and you're buying whatever poster boards, and then halfway through there the money's gone, and it's not, the work that you've done is not connected to your strategy. So concretely laying out a strategy and making sure that the strategy is aligned with the budget and that you have goals and accountability tacked onto that.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if anyone else from the group wants to add something, go ahead.
Sally, I just wanted to add around the fact that we wanted to have as a best practice, and this is kind of working best practice at the organization I'm with, is establishing a directive or a policy in place. So you're absolutely right. It takes away the subjectivity of each, but it also puts the performance measures as well as some particular levels of control. And I'm saying control in a sense where it's authority and responsibility, so that someone's going to be held accountable for that actually stays with the DEI manager, just so that they can continue to keep an eye on it and say, okay, if all of the all of the ISNs, all of the ERGs, employee resource groups, are functioning in consistent manner. So that, and when we talk about consistency, it's consistency, for example, around note taking, budget and collecting of receipts and things like that. So just that create that package that goes to every ISN co-chair, which identifies how many members on the steering committee. Do you need a treasurer, et cetera, et cetera. So just that the system is already placed for them, and it's consistent across the board for every ISN or every employee resource group that's there.
So thank you for sharing. I wanted to add a couple things to that point, exactly what you were saying, the strategy, the directive, the policy. We talked earlier about executive sponsors, and I think that I may have framed it as an executive sponsor as somebody who, we lean into, but it's also their responsibility. So if we have an executive sponsor, it can be their responsibility to make sure that, we are getting the compensation, that the equity of ERGs is there, that we're not favoring one over the other, we're overlooking different ones, and the accountability piece, of course. And then I'm really glad you said, Sheila, compensation is not just money. One best practice that a lot of organizations are doing to compensate ERGs is to provide a professional development stipend. So it's like, instead of rewarding you through a bonus that only a certain number of people get, which you can think about what that does to a group dynamic, right? People are like, well, I do behind the scenes work, and yet you're getting compensated at 10,000. What about the rest of us? But the professional development stipend is a really good example of how to support people in their careers and say everybody gets like $500 that's part of an ERG, and like 1 to 2 weeks to use that instead of using it and doing your additional work as a form of compensation for helping us develop and foster inclusive workplaces. So room 4.
I was in room 4. We didn't select a person, but we were with Cornisha, Nina, and KG, I believe. Is the name. I think we talked about a lot of things and the tensions that might come up with the $10,000 being awarded to individuals, and how that might contribute to a hierarchy that already exists and that this work is wishing to dismantle. Having said that, there is value in having some sort of compensation, and so we were just kind of thinking through that tension. Also, what would that do for the relationship between the person who's the chair and the leadership? Will there be an expectation? Are they able to be authentic in the role that they're playing in the ERG? Or will they be able to push in a strong way if they're being compensated? And so we're just working through those things. We also talked about the importance of having not only the ERG be the only space where EDI work is pushed, that it has to be coupled with a person who is a staff member who has a position of power, who has leadership, who might have the ability to help coordinate the ERGs, and to be informed also by the ERGs that their work is not also, that they're not also part of our person, say, to come just do the equity. And one best practice that I just wanted to share, I work for the Toronto District School Board. There's not a lot of, anyways, I work for the Toronto District School Board. One of the practices that I think is interesting in terms of how people can get compensated for doing EDI work at the board is that they have the opportunity to take a sabbatical from their job as a teacher, for example, to work in a department and do EDI work or EDI adjacent work. And so perhaps that's another opportunity in terms of compensating people for that work, and also acknowledging that often people are playing triple duty, that they're doing their 9 to 5 and then they're doing all of this other stuff. And so if they're doing all this other stuff, is there an opportunity to take a break from their 9 to 5 and just focus on the area of interest?
So Jillery, thank you so much for sharing. I wanted to share a quick thought around what you said, and that's specifically around the sabbatical. And this is just feedback that I've heard from people that have been offered that sabbatical. Some people have shared that if you're taken away from your area, that even if you're doing DEI work, it can prevent you from developing the skill set for an extended period of time to be a subject matter expert in your area. So let's say you're an engineer and you're pulled, and you believe in DEI because it impacts you in your community, and then you're pulled away. Does that take away from that? And so I don't know the answer myself. I'm just sharing that in my work on both those areas, the ERG and the DEI space, it's a conversation that we had. And one thing we landed at is putting into place a practice where we focus on prioritization ahead of productivity. So there's only 24 hours in a day. Assuming we work 8 hours in a day, what fair breakdown are we giving to our employees or staff or whatever, ourselves, to say this is what we do within the time that we have instead of adding on. So not to say this is a right or wrong. I'm very curious as to how it works out at the TDSB. Maybe we can have a side conversation about that, but did want to share some additional thoughts that I've come across. So we're at 8:38 my time. I want to open this up to Q&A for groups 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I would love for you to drop your, if one person can drop in what their best practices in the chat. In the previous chat, I did save it and I did build it into our best practices. So it's one way that we're going to continue to do this is hear from the group, seeing as they mix up every time, and the ones we don't, I'll continue to collect those best practices. And I also want to walk you through the assignment. So let me just do that quickly, and then I'll ask you your questions. So the assignment number 7 is around ERGs. And what I've done here is shared 2 companies, Company A and Company B, and how they've approached ERGs differently. So one of them has asked ERGs to create programs and policies, but there's no budget and there's no headcount. And then Company B has put into place a recognition award system, and they do have a headcount, but they're not, ERG leaders are not invited in as key stakeholders. So in summary, neither one are doing a perfect job at all. But my question is trying to get you to think through that DEI lens, what mistakes is Company A making, what mistakes is Company B making, and then recommend one tool or technique to improve outcomes for future ERGs. For the groups that did share, this is an excellent way to approach it, is what you were coming up with, strategic, policies, directives, accountability processes, roadmaps. These are examples of something you can put in place, and hopefully that gives you some insights as to what I'm looking for assignment number 7. Tahira, you had your hand up?
Yes, I had a question. Earlier, you had spoke about having allies be a part of the work, the ERG and all of that. But my question is, how do we identify who's really an ally? Because that's not something that's necessarily a self-appointed title. And unfortunately, you do have a lot of people who do join a lot of these groups or want to lead a lot of these efforts just for the compensation and not to do the actual work.
Yeah, and I wanted to quickly say, because of the technological difficulties ahead, I did want to extend another 10 minutes, so beyond when our class ends. So please, if that works for you, if not, I apologize, but that time is there. So I'm going to be here for another 10 minutes after our class ends. So Tyra, to answer your question, when it comes to allies, because of what the Human Rights Council detailed, we have to open up membership to everybody when it comes to legal ERGs within organizations. However, when it comes to, like, we can ensure that we don't have a performative ally in the position of leadership through a voting process. We don't just want to appoint somebody, we want to perhaps vote them in from the community. And if the community, I mean, we can often sniff out performative allyship. So we can use that as an example of governance to say, let's vote in somebody who does not exhibit these qualities. As far as the people who participate, there is no real way of taking them out. I guess we could have something in the mandate that says if you exhibit performative allyship, we will ask you to leave. I don't know the legal implications around that, so I'll have to look into that, but hopefully that gives you some sort of insight. And I just wanted to thank you. Yes, allyship it's not self-appointed. For those that don't know, the term ally is somebody gives to you, not something that you can call yourself. If that's what you're doing, you really need to revisit what the word allyship means. So I had seen
Hi, yeah, Nina. I think
Nina,
I was,
yes,
like,
please
quick,
go ahead.
the due date, it's due on the 17th at 11:59 p.m. or it's due the 18th,
So
11:59 p.m.
it's due April 17th.
by midnight.
Yeah, 11:59 p.m.
So you want it before Monday, not before Tuesday? Because on this slide, the way I would read this, it says April 18th, 11:59 p.m. PT, which to me is 3 a.m. Tuesday morning. So it's before our next class, which gives me Monday to do work. So that's.
So
I appreciate the discussion because I turned in assignments late because I was.
yeah, okay. So let's do this, okay? Because majority of you are on Eastern time, the 2:59 a.m. thing is very confusing. And so I am going to make the executive decision to say it is due at April 18th, okay? And I'm writing this down to make sure there's absolutely no confusion. And I'll post an update on the classroom. April 18th, 11:59 PST, which is April 19th, 2:59 a.m. EST. Okay? Does that work? Great. Okay. So that is something I will absolutely make sure of. And again, I apologize. I'm not the one coming up with the deadlines, but that's not to say that I can't give you clarity. I will definitely push that extra day because that 11:59 is not this 18th. It's actually the 17th for Pacific time people. So thank you for your question, Nina. I think that applied to a lot of people. Luz?
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask around some clarity for, you posted the template, the rubric, I should say, and I just had it up, but you said if you could, here it is. For assignment number 6, if you give detail to every stakeholder, you said how you plan to hold each group accountable and thinking through an equitable and inclusive lens. Can you give examples of what you mean by every stakeholder you detail? Does that mean like parent, entrepreneur, executives in the area? Is that what you mean by stakeholders?
Yeah, so when we have a DEI program, who's a stakeholder to make sure it comes to life? And so using Dr. Fry's example of a parent when we talk about sports participation, perhaps one of the things that we can do is think about how to hold parents accountable to participating as stakeholders, right? And one example may be to say, when you enroll your child, there is an expectation that you are part of this community. Like, you are not just dropping off your child, you're part of the success, the sports success that your child may experience in the arena. So it could be something like a statement of responsibility, but then in terms of leaders or managers, it could be something that's built into the promotional reviews or the compensation model, right? So it's a different idea, but it's definitely my ask is to think in terms of closing that loop. Otherwise, think of it as leakage, right? Like, you have something, it's a great idea, but if we don't have that accountability piece, then people are like, I'm busy, it's COVID, and it just all goes out the window. So we want to have something in place. Think of like a statement as a lower end example of accountability, and a process or a checklist that's built into pay and promo as a high end accountability process. Either way, we need something in place.
Now, because I'm not technically in the space, what would you put in as accountability other than checklists or team norms? How could you make external forces accountable?
I think that, it could come from a code of ethics. It could come from self-awareness or self-accountability. It can come from the number of times you've done something. It really depends on the context. There's a great article by Dr. Janice Gassam called Accountability is the Missing Link to Your DEI Work, and that provides some additional examples there. But really, it's about making sure that people don't give up on something when something else comes along their way. And that can be applied to any context, from single founder entrepreneur to big box organizations. I think it's something that we can all relate to in some way or form.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Devin?
Yeah, I think I wanted to maybe get some thoughts and a little feedback on back to the employees resource group. So there's something around kind of
the success, the sports success that your ability, but then in terms of leaders or managers, it could be something that's built into the promotional reviews or the compensation model, right? So it's a different idea, but it's definitely my ask is to think in terms of closing that loop. Otherwise, think of it as leakage, right? Like, you have something, it's a great idea, but if we don't have that accountability piece, then people are like, I'm busy, it's COVID, and it just all goes out the window. So we want to have something in place. Think of like a statement as a lower end example of accountability, and a process or a checklist that's built into pay and promo as a high end accountability process. Either way, we need something in place.
Now, because I'm not technically in the space, what would you put in as accountability other than checklists or team norms? How could you make external forces accountable?
I think that, it could come from a code of ethics. It could come from self-awareness or self-accountability. It can come from the number of times you've done something. It really depends on the context. There's a great article by Dr. Janice Gassam called Accountability is the Missing Link to Your DEI Work, and that provides some additional examples there. But really, it's about making sure that people don't give up on something when something else comes along their way. And that can be applied to any context, from single founder entrepreneur to big box organizations. I think it's something that we can all relate to in some way or form.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Devin?
Yeah, I think I wanted to maybe get some thoughts and a little feedback on back to the employees resource group. So there's something around kind of this inclusivity, exclusivity thing that I think we definitely need to sit with. Something I've tried is having kind of certain events really be for folks who are in that identity, and then other events maybe be open to other folks who want to show up as allies or who are interested in learning about things. Really, and it's been more around like celebrations being open to everyone else, and then when we have to maybe talk about certain sensitive topics, really having that invite only. Do you feel like that aligns with the kind of code of ethics that HRC is trying to, the spirit behind that?
HRC, and let me see if I can drop in that article so that we can read it in our own time. But HRC says that the definition of an ERG cannot be based on identity. I don't remember the exact wording of it, but it's how you can't exclude people based on identity. I think that's what it is, because that falls under discrimination. If you exclude someone based on their identity, then that is illegal. And so we have to be really cautious as ERGs to say, if I'm, for example, part of the Black Employee Network, that is open to Black employees and allies of Black employees. To answer your question, yes, I definitely think when it comes to any sort of celebration, we can absolutely open it, and then we can for sure have a closed governance model where it's almost like a board of directors, like the leaders of the ERGs get together and they say, we are representatives of the community and we're going to discuss our strategies, our policies and practices. This is not open to everybody, even within our group. This is open to a select number of people, and that's different than joining an ERG. Yeah, it was interesting to me because I didn't know that this was rooted in legal terms, but apparently it is. So that was something, as I was doing research for this particular class, that I learned about myself, and I wanted to share that with you all. Jillery?
Yeah, is that an American thing?
The law around that?
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, actually. That's a good
I
question.
I feel like it is. I don't have much experience with affinity groups on the staff level, but with affinity groups or what would be the equivalent of ERGs at a student level, where students are organizing around identity, it's absolutely acceptable for them to say it's a space exclusively for Black communities or Muslim communities or this, that, and the other. And it doesn't, from a Canadian perspective, my understanding, it hasn't been challenged or met the challenge threshold for under the Human Rights Code in Canada.
So I would say that, sorry, this is Salia. So Jillery, what happens is, so I have allies coming in, right? So for example, the Black ISN or the Unity ISN, which is for women. So we do have allies that are part of conversations that come in, and allyship is extremely important because I'm very careful in terms of who decides to and who comes on board as allies. I actually end up interviewing them and kind of like having a conversation with them before I would even say, okay, welcome on board. For everybody else, everybody says, hey, I want to be. I'm like, right away, there's no question, no whatever. You as long as you identify with that particular identity, you're welcome. With the whole notion around creating the safe space, what I do is when it comes to activities, there are activities where they're open to everyone. So allies, they're champions, sponsors are going to be there to brag about them, et cetera, et cetera. That all happens. And those are usually kind of the marketing and promotion events or education and learning and awareness events that they're hosting, so lunch and learns and things like that. But I also create those spaces where it is only the members who identify as part of that core group or with that identity. They're the ones who are going to come together and have those very critical and sometimes difficult conversations around what kind of support and what kind of community they need to have around them. And as far as allies are concerned, when they're walking in, I would have had that conversation with them that you're not going to find yourself welcome in every single space. And if you're uncomfortable with that, this employee resource group is not for you.
So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate, the added expertise around this. I did want to say that the Human Rights Council is a organization that is part of the intergovernmental body within the United Nations system made up of 47 states. So it is not just the US, and I have the article here. I will post it in the classroom thread about what the exact language is around the identity piece, and how to make sure that it's still a safe space for the community members that it's meant to be. I just think you can't close that door within an organization to anybody based on their identity. That's really what it's framing this legal point around. But in practice, as often we see in workplaces, things pan out differently. We have the legal and then we have the in practice, right? But it's still very important to know these details when we develop ERGs so that nobody gets, sued or feels unsafe more so on the other side as a result of all of this. Okay, well, we are at 8:54 my time. I have another couple minutes if anybody has any follow-up questions specifically around ERGs. But I did note down your best practices. I'm going to save this chat and I will make the changes to the assignment so that that's more clear. And I will make sure that the date is changed for this assignment so it's reflective of most of your time zones. Hopefully that's helpful. And I did want to say that I'm here with my family after a really long time. I have a little 7-year-old boy. He has vitiligo, so his skin gets affected by the sun. But we found some new medication recently, so we've been able to finally get a nice vacation together. And it's been really meaningful for me and my husband and my son, Sean. And I just want to thank you for your patience as I grappled a little bit with the technology. That was my husband that you saw. Adam, his middle name is Fahim, so he goes by Fahim. But I appreciate you just understanding as I kind of shift around with different screens this time than I usually do. I don't like to give you a disrupted experience, and I'm sorry if there was a couple lull periods there. So thank you for joining. We're going to be talking about resources in our next class, and it's sort of a continuation about this. I want to equip you as best as possible to find a way to get resources, because coming back to our very first class, a lot of us are suffering from burnout, and I really believe burnout is a cause of resources, not having enough headcount, not having enough support, constantly fighting with armor on, and so that's what the next class is really all about. And I'm really proud of all the work you're doing, and thank you for showing up and sharing, and I wish you well until we meet again in another 48 hours. So take care, everybody.